This is Oscar, aka I'm from Sweden, for Poker VIP. Today I am going to talk about how to win pots in position in 3-bet pots, because I think it's quite an important topic, because 3-bet pots, they're naturally larger than normal pots, so knowing when is a good spot to bluff or when can you try to make a move ends up affecting your bottom line quite a bit in the end. So we're going to focus on flop play just because you have lots of opportunities to play the flop, but fewer on the turn and reverse. So we're going to talk about when he checks you, when is a good spot to stab, and should we continue or should we try to go for a delayed stab perhaps, or just not do anything at all. And then when he bets, if we can try to perhaps bluff raise, or if we should try a float, and when is a good opportunity. And in the end, just some mixed examples from both, and perhaps a few interesting hands. But let's start with the stabbing. So, what is important when we're thinking about stabbing? We want to be able to represent hands, right? More hands than he can as well. So perfect runouts are, for example, middling runouts, like queen high boards are good, jack high boards are good, 10 high even, because our calling range versus a 3-bet is going to consist of a lot of like these jack 10, queen jack, king queen, even king 10, queen 10, and those kinds of hands. Whereas his 3-betting range is usually a bit more polarized, because people often tend to just like call a raise with king queen and hands of that type. So middling runouts are usually quite good for stabbing. Another good thing when thinking about stabbing is trying to have a little bit of equity. Of course, this helps any bluff, but also true for this. So having a gut shot or backdoor flush draw or overcards, anything really helps quite a bit. Another point is be very careful about stabbing on ace-high boards. I felt I needed to make this into a point by itself, just because it's so dangerous to try and bluff people on these ace-high boards, because it's super common that people 3-bet like ace-5 suited or something, and the flop is like a dry ace-high flop, and people, for some reason, they just love to go for these check calls with ace-x, and then they're just never folding with top pair. And sometimes they check call like a high pair, for example, kings or queens on an ace-high board. So I've learned the hard way, so I hope you don't have to. And another point is we should be careful about stabbing on drawy boards. And this might seem counterintuitive, because people are going to be check folding overcards on drawy boards often. But at the same time, you're very often going to get check raised, because it's such a common spot. Like, people know that you're going to be stabbing a lot of drawy boards. So what they do is like they always check raise over pairs and the draws, and sometimes they see bet their high cards just because they know they have a lot of fold equity, since it looks very strong. So in today's games, I feel like we should be very careful about when we're stabbing on drawy boards. Yeah. So I also included one example here on the right side. This is a typical good stabbing spot. So we open and he 3-bets if we call, and the flop is jack 9-3, which is quite dry. There are some middling cards, the jack and maybe a bit the 9 as well. And we also have some outs. So I think this is a very classical spot to be betting. But you should note my sizing. It's only a bit above half pot. There's no reason to bet like 13 big blinds or something here. Because whatever he's check folding, he's probably check calling regardless. Like, I don't expect him to be check calling ace king to a 9 big blind and then fold it to a 13 or something. I expect him to be folding those regardless. And if he has like ace 9 or something, like some sort of pair, I don't think he's check folding regardless. And betting a bit smaller also sets up for better bet sizing on further streets. So we can set up for a decent sizing on the turn and then river, so we can get it all in. Yeah. So like I said, yeah, middling cards is good, relatively dry is good. But having no equity makes this bluff a little bit worse. So we have king 4 suited, we call a 3-bet. And we decide to bet. Yeah, like, this is a fine spot. It's not as good as if you would have had like queen 9 or something, of course, but even having no equity, the other factors just weigh up for it. Because he has so many hands, he's just gonna check fold here. So we could be going for a delayed c-bet here, if we think that he's going to be check folding everything on the turn that he's already check folding on the flop. But I think I prefer just betting the flop. Going to be a bit more resilient on a lot of turns. For example, a queen, he's not going to fold a king then, or even like a 9, he's going to be betting himself. And the king is going to improve a lot of his range. Obviously an ace, but even like an 8 or 9 is going to give him a straight draw with a lot of hands, which means that he might just go for a semi bluff or something, because we look weak as well when we check back this flop. So I think I prefer just stabbing once on this board. In our next hand, we have king jack, and the flop is very, very drawy. There's both lots of straight draws as well as a flush draw out there. So I'm definitely afraid of getting check raised here. But at the same time, we have a very good hand for semi bluffing. We have 2 overcards and also a straight draw, as well as a backdoor flush draw. So what we can do is just bet really small. Because if he has like ace 4 or ace 6, he's going to give up regardless of the sizing. Whereas if he has like a flush draw or a pair, he's not going to fold no matter what size we do it. So I think we save ourselves quite a lot by just making it a bit smaller on the flop. But on these dry boards, or these drawy boards, it's often a good idea to go for a delayed stab instead. Because the reasoning for this is that if he has a no equity hand like ace 8 or I don't know, king 7 or whatever he decides to 3-bet, those hands are often going to have like very little equity and are not going to be bluffing on further streets anyway. So if we think that he's often going to check raise us, we can just go for a delayed stab instead. So if he has a flush draw or an overpair, he's often just going to bet the turn if we check back the flop, whereas the weaker hands are going to check twice and then check fold. But I think it's okay to just bet the flop as well, if we bet a little bit smaller. And it depends on the guy we meet. If he's very tricky, then I think checking back is a bit better. The next hand, we have the 8-7 suited. Flop is queen 5-4 with a flush draw. Oh, sorry. 1 second. There we go. So flop is queen 5-4 with a flush draw. We have some equity, we can see. We have two overcards that might be good if he has some middle pair or high cards. But we also have the 3 or 4 outs, depending on if he has the flush or not, to the straight. Is that the flop is queen high, which is very good for us, because we can have so many queens in our range. Ace queen, king queen, queen jack, queen 10, they all make perfect sense. So we can represent a lot of hands, we have some equity. The flop isn't super drawy given our ranges. Because we shouldn't have super many like low cards that can make straight draws on this board, and neither should he. So the only real draw is the 6-7 perhaps, and the flush draw. So case for stabbing here. We should also consider going for a delayed stab instead, but I think I prefer just betting the flop in this case. And the reason is that, for example, on a king, he can decide to bluff, or he picks up some equity. Or an ace is bad because he can represent the ace. The jack often gives him a couple of straight draws. If he has like ace 10 or something, he picks up an overcard and the straight draw. And even if it comes another heart, then if he has a heart in his hand, he also picks up some equity. So by checking back, I think we give him the chance to bluff us on the turn on a lot of cards. In our next hand, we have king 7, and we get 3-bet as always. And the flop is 9-4-5. We have some equity, our overcard, also backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. The problem is that it's not like super many hands that we can represent. We can't really represent a 4 or a 5, we wouldn't bet those. And we don't have that many 9s, maybe like ace 9, king 9, 10 9. But a lot of our range have missed this board. So that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to stab this. Check back the flop to see how he reacts on the turn. This carries the risk that perhaps we get bluffed on the turn, or he picks up equity. But on the other hand, I think he's not going to check fold super often on this board. I think he might even check call like ace king here. So the safe play would have been to check back the flop and evaluate on the turn. In our next hand, we have king deuce, and we get min 3-bet, heads up. And the flop is very drawy, of course. He checks, and on this board, like, we should always be very careful here, because they love to check raise these boards. We also have no equity, so I think stabbing here is a little bit ambitious. It's definitely going to work sometimes when he has 0 equity hands, but a lot of the time he's going to check raise or check call here. Even like a naked 9, he might check raise us here, just because we have so much air when we are stabbing on these boards. So I think a better option would have been to check back, and if he checks turn again, then we can definitely stab, because people tend to bet the turn after if the original trap didn't work. In this hand we have king 6 spades. We get 3-bet, we call, and another drawy board. 10-9 deuce, 2 hearts. we have some equity here. We have the backdoor flush draw, the overcard, which is positive. But once again, it's such a drawy board that he's always going to be trying to trap us here. I think it's okay to bet, especially if you bet this sizing, just half pot. It doesn't need to work that often. But once again, I think checking back is a perfectly fine option on this board for the same reason I explained earlier. So on to the next point, talking about if it should be floating or if it should be raising. Because a lot of the time, both people are going to miss a flop, and it's up for grabs who wins the pot. He's often going to c-bet, and we have a couple of things we can do. We can either bluff raise or float. Back in the day, everybody used to be bluff raising, and floating wasn't very popular. Especially flush draws, I remember that if there was a flush draw on the flop and somebody called, they didn't have the flush draw because people would always raise the flush draw. So if the flush hit, you could always just go for a bet shove, and it would work most of the time. Whereas these days, it's quite different. People have realized that it's a lot better to be calling a lot of hands than to be raising a lot of hands. So I think floating should be our standard for a lot of reasons. It strengthens our calling range because, his range is going to be stronger in general. He has higher pairs, more top pairs, whereas our range is more like middling kind of hands. Perhaps second pair or top pair with a weaker kicker. So by calling our stronger hands and our draws as well, we keep our range a bit wider. So it's not as easy for him to be pushing us off our hands. It's also good because we can hit a lot of turn cards that he's going to be bluffing. For example, King 10 of diamonds. We hit a flush draw and 2 other cards on the flop. By just calling here, we can pick up a bluff on a lot of kings, because people love to bluff kings, and even a 10 and flush draw as well can be good to just bluff catch on, because he might very well be bluffing when the flush comes in. It's a little bit cheaper on average to be floating versus to be bluff raising, because if you're floating, then you can usually he's usually going to be checking the turn when he doesn't have anything, and he's going to check fold. So by bluff raising, you're how do I say this? He separates his range on the turn. If he has a strong hand, he's often going to keep on betting, whereas if he has a weaker hand, he's instead going to be check folding. Whereas if we bluff range, we have no idea to differentiate between when he has a strong hand and when he has a weak hand. So bluff raising might be profitable, but floating is usually more profitable, just because we can go to the turn where he will make it even more clear when he has a hand and when he doesn't. So floating is definitely the standard play. There are a couple of spots I think bluff raising is better, but I will go through those later. I'll begin with good spots to be floating. In this hand we have King 8. He c-bets on a Jack 4 with a flush draw. We have some outs. The King might be an out, the 8 might be an out. We have the backdoor. But more importantly, the 2 jacks, they hit us a lot better than they hit him. Like I explained earlier, we have all these Broadway cards, whereas he's a bit more polarized between strong hands and weak hands. Also, raising makes little sense here. If we had a jack, then surely we wouldn't raise. We would want to let him keep on bluffing, So we have to use the same reasoning when we have an actual bluff. Call the flop. The turn is the ace of spades, which isn't the best card because he can certainly have some aces in his range. But I think he has enough other hands as well. And I also bet very small, just 15.5 into 41. And this is because I'm planning on shoving the river as well. Because even if he has like ace 10, ace 9 or whatever, it's certainly possible that he will fold the river if I shove, given that there's both the flush draw is out there, yeah, as well as the jack that will keep on betting. I also think he has like kings or queens or even like tens with a spade that's going to keep on calling the turn that will definitely fold to a river bet. So yeah, definitely planning on following through this on the river, but fortunately he folds on the turn already. In this hand we have 7-8 of clubs, and we get 3-bet. Flop is quite dry, 9-5-5. And this is another hand where it makes little sense to raise. We wouldn't raise a 9 here, because parts of his range is too strong. And we wouldn't raise a 5, because that makes little sense as well. So we have some equity. We have the 6 that gives us basically the nuts, as well as backdoor flush draw. So folding is out of the question. I think just calling and then playing a turn is better. Unfortunately, he keeps on betting, and there's not much we can do. He can certainly have lots of overpairs, and the strongest hand we can have is a 9. So just folding is okay here. This hand we have 6-7 of spades. Flop is 2-3-5. We have 2 overcards. One card to the straight that might give us a lot of potential implied odds, since any ace also makes the bottom straight. So we call the flop. We wouldn't want to raise here because it wouldn't make much sense. What would we want to raise for value here? Not that many hands, so it's better to just call the flop and try to bet on the turn if he checks to us. So on the turn we hit a 7, and he keeps on betting. At this point he can certainly have some overpairs, but he can also just be bluffing this, or have some sort of draw. So I think calling again is perfectly fine. We have still lots of outs, and potentially some implied odds as well. So on the river, the ace hits, which is quite interesting because he checks. I don't think he pairs the ace that often, because if he has ace king or ace queen, I think he often just shoves himself because it's a strong enough hand, and I don't think he's bluffing ace 10, ace 9 that often on the flop and turn. So if he has a speed, I think it's quite often going to be from overpairs. So I think by shoving ourselves, we can quite possibly make him fold a lot of those hands, because we can still have some aces. For example, ace queen that's very suspicious, or ace 5, ace 3, ace 2, ace 4, and we can certainly have some sets even still. So yeah, I think what I wanted to show was the flop and turn play specifically. I think river is debatable. I think my play is fine though. Here we have queen jack, and the flop is quite dry, 10-6-3, and here I decided to bluff raise. Can be good. For example, if we think our opponent is very likely to barrel many turns, then it makes sense to raise the flop already. For example, on this board, 10-6-3, he's likely to barrel, for example, a king or ace. But I also think he just barrels like a lot of dry cards, because so much of our range is going to be like low pairs, low pocket pairs, as well as like ace highs on this board quite often. So I think we get barreled here quite a bit, which makes floating obviously quite a bit worse. At the same time, I think it's much harder to play back against a raise with absolute nothing. So I elected to raise here. But for example, if this guy was really suspicious of me or very aggressive, then I wouldn't raise here, because we don't have that many value hands, which is a problem. Because in 3-bet pots, you generally want to call your strong hands. So when you raise, it always looks a little bit suspicious. So if they are on the active side or the suspicious side, then they're often going to try to rebluff you or just even call you down with ace-king here. So you should be careful. But against tighter opponents, which there are quite a few of as well, I think it's fine to bluff raise here. Also because like he doesn't have that many value hands himself. A lot of his range is going to be miss over cards or low plus low, high plus low, for example, like ace-5 or those kinds of hands. And we can still have a couple of value hands. He might expect us to be raising ace-10 for value here, or something like that. I even think it would have been better to be bluff raising this hand if we didn't have Queen Jack, because Queen Jack still is quite playable on a lot of turns. We can keep calling on a 9 or a Queen or a Jack or a King, of course. So if I had to divide my range, I would probably call Queen Jack and bluff raise some even weaker hands. But versus the right opponents, bluff raising can be better in a vacuum. So in this hand, we have absolutely no equity. 4-6 on Jack-9 deuce. We don't even have a backdoor flush draw. What's positive, however, is that this board hits our range much better than it hits his range. For reasons I mentioned earlier, like we have much more jacks and he has much more aces and kings. And I don't think floating is that good, because he's going to be bluffing on a lot of turns. He might barrel a queen. If he has like a 10, then he's going to barrel when he picks up a straight draw. And he might just barrel pure overcards. And he might just barrel pure blanks even. Because we have like a lot of ace queen, ace 10 that might call, and some pocket pairs that's lower than 9 that will call once and then fold. So I don't think it's that unreasonable to expect him to be sometimes bluffing complete blanks. So for those reasons, I think raising here is better. And the final reason is that like he's going to be c-betting this board quite often in the end, which means that like a large portion of his range is going to be air, which means that we have all the factors that we need in order to make a profitable bluff raise. So we make a small raise, and it works out. There's no reason to be raising that much bigger than this. The only thing we need to make sure is that he folds all of these ace-high kind of hands. So just raise to whatever amount you think that he will fold ace-king to. Alright, time for some mixed examples. 5-9 suited. It's definitely borderline. calling the pre-flop 3-bet. And in hindsight, it might have been better to 4-bet or fold. But at the same time, I don't think it's horrible. And especially if you think you have an edge on the guy or have some reason to believe that you can make it profitable, then I think it's totally fine. We also flop quite well, obviously, flush draw and straight draw. Now we have to decide if we want to raise the flop or even go all in perhaps, or if we want to float. And my standard play is always to float here. Like, I need a reason for raising, otherwise I want to float. And it's just the standard reasons for floating, like keeping your range stronger, giving him a chance to bluff on good cards for us, and also saving a bit of money when we miss. Just utilizing our position advantage. So we call the flop, and turn is a queen, he bets, and we shove. I think calling is fine as well, but I think shoving is better here. And the reasoning is that I think the queen is a card that he bluffs very often. When we call the flop, we can have lots of middle pairs, lots of straight draws, 10-9, even we call like Jack-9 here perhaps, Jack-10. We have some flush draws and pocket pairs, 8s, and a few kings of course. So I think he's going to be bluffing anytime he has Ace-10, Ace-Jack, Jack-9, like all of these hands he's going to be bluffing very often, I think, on the turn. And I think he might even follow through on the river sometimes, or improve. So I think shoving the turn is a little bit better. So I do, and he ends up folding. Next hand, we have King-9 of spades. Small blind favors us, and we call. Flop is Queen 5-5. We definitely don't want to be raising here. Like, even if we have a 5, we would not be raising because it wouldn't make much sense. We want to let him keep on bluffing if we have a 5 and all that good stuff. So we call flop, and he checks the turn to us, and we bet, and he calls. River is a blank, and this is a spot where I think lots of people end up not betting because they think, oh, he check called turn, the draw missed, he's probably going to get suspicious and end up calling me down. But I think this is spots where you just have to man up and just shove. Because our range is quite wide going into the turn. We have, of course, some queens and very few 5s. But like a large portion of our range is going to be floats or draws or ace-x even. Which means that on the turn, I think he's going to be check calling quite wide, especially to our sizing. I don't think he's folding ace-king, for example, or even ace-jack or a small pair. So by betting river, I think he folds all ace-highs. I hope he folds pairs lower than queens. And I don't think he has a queen that often, to be honest. Like, sometimes, of course, he has a queen, but we talked about this earlier. We have more queens than he does. He doesn't have that many queens even to begin with. So, and like I said, I think his range on the turn is very wide. So I think by betting the river, we get a lot of stuff to fold, more stuff than we think. And it doesn't have to work every time as well. So I feel like this is a spot where people often end up not betting the river, where I think it's quite mandatory. And I think this might be the final hand. We have 6s, and small blind 3-bets, big blind calls, and we call as well. So we're 3-way into the flop, and I know from before that small blind is a regular, just a normal regular, perhaps on the tightish side, and I know that big blind is a little bit loosey-goosey. We should also note that we are 130 big blinds effective with a small blind, and we're 3-way on the flop. So I decided to go for a bluff raise. We can certainly call here, but I think when he c-bets into 3 people, I think he very often has an overpair here. And by raising a little bit deeper into 3 people, well, to be fair, then only 2 people are left when it comes to me. But in small blind's eyes, it's still like a 3-way pot. So we make a small raise. I also think we wouldn't do this with too many bluffs. For example, I think most people call 10-9 here. And apart from 10-9, there's not that much that we can be bluffing with. And I don't think anyone pulls off like 0 equity bluff here. So given that, I think raising here looks very strong. So we make a small raise on the flop, he calls, and the turn is a king. And he shakes, and we go through with our plan and we shove here. We're hoping to fold out some pairs below queens, because I don't think queens fold either. But for example, if he has jacks here or similar, I think he's in a really terrible spot. And if he somehow has like some kind of 8 or anything weaker, then I think those are definitely folding as well. So overall, I think it's quite a fine play, this. And I think we should be looking for these spots, especially when we're a little bit deeper in 3-way pots, when we can represent really strong hands. We shouldn't be afraid to go for it. I think that was the last one. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know this is a tough topic. 3-way pots, or what I'm saying, 3-bet pots are difficult to play. But it's such an important situation that I think it's good to think over when we should try to win the pot without actually having a hand always. I'll give you some pointers that can get you thinking. Leave any comments or any suggestions in the comment section below, and I will read and respond. And also, if you have any suggestions for videos going forward, then I'll be happy to listen. I'm not entirely sure what I have planned for the next video. Perhaps I will talk a little bit about overbetting, when it's a good overbet spot. Or perhaps I'll do a live playing session. I am not sure yet. So just leave some suggestions below, and I will listen. Have a good day, everyone. Over and out.